Hello everybody, welcome back. It's Joe R, Vintage Pokemon, and we're taking a look at two iconic cards that need no introduction, base set First Edition Blastoise and base set First Edition Charizard. The topic of today's video though is the First Edition stamp that's on each of these cards. We're specifically going to be talking about thick stamps versus thin stamps and how exactly they are different from one another. So stick around as we do a deep dive on the facts for base set First Edition thick versus thin stamps. Today we're going to be discussing the hot topic of base set First Edition thick stamps versus thin stamps. I want to run you guys through the gambit of basically what makes a card a thick stamp or a thin stamp for base set First Edition. So I think the first thing we have to do is talk about what is it that makes a card a thick stamp compared to an actual thin stamp. So when we say thick stamp, we're referring to the thickness of the number 1 that is on the actual card. So when you look at Blastoise and Charizard here, how wide the number 1 in the actual card is, that's going to determine whether or not the card is a thick or thin stamp. Besides this, there's one other thing, and that is the lettering in the word edition. The lettering in the word edition on the thick stamp is much thinner. It's less bold, you could say. But on the thin stamp for the Charizard you see here, it's actually going to be a much thicker lettering. So let's take a look at our Blastoise here. First, for an example, you can see the stamp right there. It's going to be wider than the Charizard's number 1. And the lettering of edition is going to be much thinner. When we take a look at the Charizard, just to put that back for 1 second, the Charizard that you see here, the number 1 is a lot more thin, hence the name thin stamp. But the lettering in edition is much more bold. It looks thicker almost. So when we compare them side by side, that's when you can really see the difference between these two cards. You can see that the Blastoise's stamp, the number 1 is certainly wider. There's more of a gap from side to side of the black portion of the stamp. And on the Charizard, the number 1 is certainly thinner. And that gap is not as wide between the sides of the stamp. The edition on the Blastoise, the lettering in edition, is much more fine, and for Charizard, it looks a bit more bold. So, why call it thick stamp and thin stamp at all? As a matter of fact, there's a lot of confusion around why these are called thick and thin. Well, like we said, the thick and thin aspect is in regards to the number 1. But the confusion comes into play with that word edition. A lot of people looking at these stamps tend to think that the Charizard is actually the thick stamp because of the lettering in the word edition. And they actually wonder why they didn't call it thick to begin with for that reason. Well, 15 years ago, when the term was first coined, they just went with the number 1 being the defining factor. And after 15 years, you obviously can't switch suddenly. That term has stuck. So now, when we talk about thick stamp and thin stamp, we are permanently going to be referring to how wide that number 1 symbol actually is. The gap that makes it up again, in other words. Now, to be clear, these are two different stamps. It's not like they're from the same machine and we just used more ink on one than the other. They're two totally different stamps. And we can see that if we look at a few other examples. Here we have two Magneton Hollows, except one is a thick stamp and one is a thin stamp. Can you tell which one is which actually? The card on the right is the thin stamp and the card on the left is the thick stamp. And if we bring them up close, we can see that big difference between the two of them. You can see that the number 1 is certainly wider on the thick stamp, the card on the left. The card on the right, the thin stamp, has more boldness in the word edition, and the number 1 is a lot thinner. There is less space between the two black sides of the stamp. So now that we've looked at two examples, let's talk about the origins of thick and thin stamps. First off, nobody knows which one actually came first when we talk about thick stamps and thin stamps. It's really anybody's guess. Wizards of the Coast was really just trying to figure things out back in 1999, and I'm sure they weren't paying too much attention to it to begin with. What we do know is that all of the holographic cards and set cards after base set first edition permanently switched over to being thin stamps. So all cards, Jungle through Neo Destiny, after base set first edition, all permanently switched to the stamp you see here on this Charizard card. They all became thin stamps. That means thick stamps are exclusive specifically to base set first edition. Now, when it comes to the rest of the actual set, the non-holographic cards, for the most part, all of the non-holographic cards are actually thick stamps. So when we take a look at this pile of bulk first edition that I have here, every single one of these has a thick stamp on it. Voltorb, Ponyta, Abra, they all have a thick number 1, and that very fine spelling of the word edition. It's not bold like it is on the thin stamp holographic cards. Now, on very rare occasions, there are some non-holographic cards that will have a thin stamp, but it is very, very rare. Almost all of the non-holographic cards for base set first edition are thick stamps. It's estimated that there might have only been a few sheets printed that actually had thin stamps for the non-holographic cards. Now, some of you guys might be wondering, well, does this actually mean anything in terms of the actual pricing of the cards? So, when it comes to the pricing, usually people will pay a little bit of a premium for the thick stamp holographics. Many collectors think or believe that the thick stamp holos are the true first edition cards, since a lot of people think they came first, and they also disappeared after base set first edition. Not to mention, the rest of the set, all the non-holographic cards, are also thick stamps. So for these reasons, it tends to hold a little bit of a premium. Now, on a side note, it has been noted that a test print of base set first edition did have thin stamp holographics on it. So again, that clarity of which one came first is really uncertain, although I will say it does make the most sense that thick stamps came first and thin stamps came second, for the reasons that we've already noted. It should be also noted that when it comes to the thick stamps and the thin stamps, you can find both of them in the same booster box. In other words, I could pull a thick stamp first edition Blastoise and a thin stamp first edition Charizard from the exact same booster box. So it's not limited just to finding one or the other. So how much more is a thick stamp holographic work compared to a thin stamp? Well, considering that the thick stamps are a little bit more rare and collectors tend to go after them a little bit more, they hold a little bit of a price edge on the thin stamps. Is it so notable that it makes up the difference of a grade? Not even close. Not at this point anyway. As of 2021, if you have a PSA 9 of a base set first edition card, it's going to beat out a PSA 8 first edition card every time, whether it's thick or thin. Now, if we're talking about the exact same grade, let's say these were both PSA 8s, then the thick stamp would hold probably a very slight premium. And that's only if the collector that is buying the card actually cares, or valuing the card actually cares. There's plenty of collectors that aren't even aware of thick versus thin stamps, and really just want to complete the set, whether it's thick or thin. So, now in terms of grading your cards, you'll notice that mine are all PSA cards. PSA doesn't label cards as being thick stamps or thin stamps. This is despite the two stamps being completely different. Like we said, these stamps were not from the exact same print. They are separate stamps. It's not like one had more ink than the other, and that's the reason for it. separate stamps completely. After all, like we said, the non-holo cards are all very specifically thick stamp cards. With, of course, the very rare occasion of there being a thin stamp, as we noted. So, while PSA doesn't label their cards as thick or thin, Beckett, or BGS as you say, and CGC, the other two prominent grading companies, they do label their cards as thick or thin. But over the years, there has been a lot of confusion about what is thick and thin, so I will say that I have seen cards from BGS or Beckett accidentally mislabel thin stamps as thick stamps, because, like we said, it can be a little bit confusing sometimes. Now, I want to take a moment to show you guys, before we call it quits on this, a couple other examples of thin stamps and thick stamps that I have available for you. So, taking a look, we've got a Polygraph. This is another thick stamp holographic card. We have Big Daddy Venusaur, another thick stamp first edition card. You can see that number 1, it's a lot thicker than the thin stamp. And we have a Raichu, first edition thick stamp card. Here's a couple of thin stamps now. We've got a Ninetales, a Nidoking, and a Zapper, the Zapdos. Again, doing one last comparison between the two. The Raichu on the left is the thick stamp, the Zapdos is the thin stamp. Again, noting the width of the number 1 and the letterings in the word edition. They're more bold on the thin stamp and less bold on the thick stamp. Alright, so guys, that's all for now about the differences between base set first edition, thick and thin stamps. There are other stamp variations to discuss, such as gray stamps, but we'll save that for a future video. My question to you is, which stamp do you guys prefer? Do you even care about the stamps at all? Thick, thin, does it make any difference? Tell me about it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for this video. You know we're going to have more great vintage Pokemon content coming at you. And by the way, special thanks to the forum efour, where we chat all things Pokemon. And I'm going to be making sure to put a link to some of these chats about base set first edition in the description, so you can check out those links and those conversations where a lot of this information is specifically sourced from. So till next time, guys, this is Joe R with Thick and Thin Stamps signing out. See you later, guys.